Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, when I listened to my good friend John Downing's introduction, and he mentioned having distinguished scholars from the four corners here over the period of months, and I couldn't identify myself in any of those four corners, so I said, well, maybe there is indeed a fifth corner, namely the one I was sitting over there in, and maybe I should simply stay in the fifth corner and listen to somebody else speak this evening. But it's indeed a pleasure for me to be here. And another point I want to mention earlier in this presentation, it's very rare that I get introduced as Professor anything, you see, because I'm not a professor. And I'm a senior lecturer. And you see, in the University of the West Indies British system, where the rank of professor is the rank of professor, not only if you're in the teaching, if you get called professor and you are not professor, as in having a chair, somehow you look like an imposter. So I want to say that I'm not an imposter in the sense that I do have credentials at the university, but not the credential of distinguished professor. It is a very rare and honorable title. But nevertheless, I like to be called professor. So I'm very happy when I'm in America because I get called professor even for 5 minutes. So it's a nice feeling. Ladies and gentlemen, I know that you have been through, some of you have been through these lectures before. And when I was invited to speak here and I looked at some of the issues that you've been dealing with in the Global Media Center, I really wondered why we were being asked to come here to talk about the Caribbean. Because, we are a small part of the world. And if this was another place and you wanted to talk about dancehall music or reggae music, I figure I would have a place, because then that's the home of dancehall and reggae, or the home of soca, and the home of some good sprinters and jerk chicken and all of those kinds of things. So I could talk about food and sport and all of these things that are Caribbean famous and which we are happy to share with the rest of the world. But seriously, I said, well, perhaps what's happening to us in the region might be of some interest to you as persons interested, people interested in what's happening to media and culture and communication in this postmodern period of the world, because it is indeed a very bewildering period. When I began in this business as a reporter with the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation, life was simple and life was exciting, because in those days we had 2 radio stations in Jamaica, and you worked for one or the other, and you listened to one or the other. And if you had a shortwave radio, you could perhaps pick up the BBC or Voice of America. And sometimes at night on your AM radio, you could pick up WINZ in Miami. We kept calling it WINZ, but they keep calling it WINZ. That last letter of the alphabet looks more like a Z to me than a Z, but anyway. So we learned, we heard Sarah Vaughan and Duke Ellington and all those kinds of things. And so we got to know America in a way through radio. Armed Forces Radio, BBC Radio, and got a view of the world. So all of that has changed, and perhaps what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk with you briefly about some of those changes, and then perhaps to leave enough time for questions, because I think it will be more interesting for us to share than for me to stand here and give a lecture in a formal sense, because what new am I going to tell you? Tell me something new. That's what you want to know. What is new and different? And I also want to hear something new from you. Now, I'm going to briefly remind you of the Caribbean, then look at some of the main factors that are changing the media in our region, and some of the ways in which our media industry has been responding to that. And then towards the end, we will look at some future directions for the industry and for policymakers. Now, for purposes of this presentation, the Caribbean I'm describing as the English-speaking Caribbean, and knowing full well that's not the entire Caribbean. It's not even the larger part of the Caribbean. I'm referring to the 13 or so islands and Guyana and Belize on the South and Central American mainland, which were part of the British colonial experience. The group of countries that now, from Bahamas in the north to Trinidad in the south, and I deliberately don't have a map so that you can just go there with me through your mind's eye, rather than seeing it on a map, as well as we go far west to Jamaica and Belize, and then east to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. All of that in the Caribbean archipelago. Beautiful place to spend vacation if you ever want to get away from winter, and if you ever want to find a part of the world which, not unspoiled, but where people and friendships and good food still commingle. Now, in those multicultural societies, we fashioned societies which are predominantly, in terms of ethnicity, predominantly Black, African American, but also, and by African American, I simply mean that we are part of the Americas, not part of the United States of America, but Americas, and we are originally people out of Africa. But that's not the whole story. It's a story of Chinese people, of people of Indian origin, of Europeans, a very strong mixture of people from the Middle East. And I should pause to tell you that in Jamaica, we call every Arab we call a Syrian, right? Whether you come from Lebanon or Saudi Arabia, we have one word for Arab people, Syrian. And the reason is simple. The first merchants who came to Jamaica to sell dry goods were Syrians. So the others who came, we never made any distinction. We call them all Syrians, and they all answer to being Syrian. Perhaps Jamaica is the only place where they would accept being called Syrians. because they know that in Jamaica, we take it to be out of many, we are one people. It's not a big thing for us, you know, so. And so that eclectic group of people fashioning societies and cultures and so on. And in terms of our media development, I want to talk about three distinct periods. An early period in which the pre-independence period from the 1940s through the 1960s, and then a period in which the media became under greater national ownership, and then the current period in which we have seen privatization, liberalization, and the impact of the internet. Now, in the pre-independence period that we're talking about, most of the media in our part of the world were owned by external owners, mainly British. The exception in newspapers was the Daily Gleaner in Jamaica, which had been owned by Jamaican families from 1834 and is arguably one of the longest continuing publications in the English language. Occasionally, over the last period since 1834, they perhaps have missed a couple of days because of strikes or earthquake or hurricanes or whatever it is. But it has been a continuing publication over this period of time, so making it quite an old newspaper. But apart from the Gleaner, a lot of the ownership of papers was by British media magnates, Cecil King and Roy Thomson being the two major ones. In these days of Berlusconi and Sony and Columbia and the other media giants, it is perhaps only the historians who might remember that back then in the 50s, the Cecil King's International Publishing Corporation was the largest media company in the world. you know, owning newspapers wherever the British flag flew. And the British flag flew in a lot of the world. And so they got their papers in those parts of the world. Then in radio, a company called British Rediffusion owned the 4 largest radio stations in the region at the time. Radio Jamaica in Jamaica, Radio Trinidad in Trinidad, Barbados Rediffusion in Barbados, and in Guyana, I think it was called Berbice Radio. Radio Demerara, sorry, in Guyana. And there were also, in the Eastern Caribbean, there was the Windward Island Broadcasting Service. So all of these were radio stations owned by British interests. And Reuters and the BBC were the main sources of foreign news. Then by the 1960s, times of independence, we began to see shifts in which some of the ownership began to be transferred, because once the British owners did not have the protection of the flag for their monopolies, then it was not as attractive to remain in the regions, and also they had to face the national response, the national outpouring of sentiment for national ownership of newspapers. And so they had to deal with that situation. In Trinidad, for instance, where nationals led by Ken Gordon, who is one of the major owners of private media in the region now, in his book, Getting It Right, he noted that the British media owners, including Thomson and King, neither had the stomach nor the concern for conflict with governments. And so they easily acquiesced to the official view that a responsible press is a docile press. So that they didn't engage themselves in struggles of people for freedom and independence, because that was not their struggle, that was not their issue. Their issue was to retain the British connection as long as possible and retain their source of power. So there was a gradual shift of ownership from Cecil King and Lord Thomson to indigenous owners, which are very much in evidence today. One of the exceptions being the Guyana Chronicle in Guyana, which was not sold to private interests, but was bought by the government, and remains to this day one of the few newspapers in the region which is government-owned, the Guyana Chronicle. Then the rediffusion was transferred to national ownership. I remember at the time in the 1970s when the Radio Jamaica, which was one of the rediffusion 4, owned by British Rediffusion, was being transferred. I was then working as Michael Manley's press secretary, and it was in his government in the 1970s which this was happening. And there was a big to-do because the government already owned the JBC, which was the state-owned broadcaster, And now the government acquiring Radio Jamaica from British Rediffusion would create an even larger government monopoly. And there was no desire for that. So the thing was now, how do you get national ownership without government ownership? And you either go to the market and you sell it openly on the marketplace, or you find some other way to for it to happen. I'm not sure why the market didn't respond, but the market didn't respond to the way the owners had anticipated. So what eventually happened was that the ownership became, of Radio Jamaica at that time, a very interesting thing, because it was the 51% of the equity in the company was made available to what was called mass-based organizations, teachers' unions, trade union, the church, and other civil, and a farmers' union. They got 51% of the equity. Then 25% of the equity was made available to the workers in the station, and the remainder was held by the government. Over time, that ownership changed, and the government gradually sold its equity. And I think a lot of the workers and the trade unions took profit and ran, because they made huge profits, so they took the profits. And now the company is a publicly listed company, and still has a shareholding structure in which no individual or group or entities can own more than 7.5% of the shares. That has become very controversial, because one of our richest men in Jamaica he has 7.5% in it, but he wanted to buy the whole thing, and he wanted an annual meeting to change the shareholding structure so that he could become a majority shareholder. Well, the teachers and the church people and the farmers, and they said no. They said they're quite happy with the way things are, because one of the things that a lot of teachers had a lot of their pension money in the station. And so they know that every month they'd get a little check, a little dividend check from their small shareholding. And they were comfortable with that. And they didn't want to see Mr. Michael Leachin as the sole owner or majority owner. So the ownership remains at a 7.5% ceiling for any individual or group. So in a sense, I think that's a fairly democratic form of ownership. So although it is a private company, it has a lot of characteristics of a public company because of that mass ownership. And from a concept, when the fear was that it was going to add to the government stables, you can see this was quite creative. Then, of course, as I said, Radio Antilles was the other station in the Eastern Caribbean, privately owned, which was also part of the mix at that time. So we moved then from foreign ownership, in which the concentration was on keeping things as they are, to national ownership, which was a lot more concerned with development and also with public involvement in media and a lot more interactive engagement. But there were also some other kinds of issues. In concert with those changes in the ownership, we also saw changes in the institutional arrangements in the media in the region. From as far back as 1967, the heads of government proposed that a news agency be created to report on and to reflect Caribbean reality, because or the world was explained to us by Reuters and the Associated Press. And so governments had that drive to start, to get it started. It ran into a lot of difficulties. As you see, it didn't really take hold until 1975, although the idea was first mooted as far back as 1967. Because there was opposition on the part of the private media in the region, because you remember what I told you, that a lot of the ownership being transferred from British to local hands, and the local hands were very skeptical of government. right? And sometimes with good reason, because in the period of national ownership of radio, many governments, including the government in Jamaica, saw the national radio stations almost as a prize of political office. You win the election, you win the radio station. And you keep the radio station as part of your communication, political propaganda, keeping out opposition forces and voices. So there was genuinely reason to be concerned. And if some of us may even go back to remember that this was also part of the period of the early debate within UNESCO of the new International Information and Communication Order, and that created its own dynamic in which a lot of the Western press, the United States in particular, and Britain and Singapore, left UNESCO at the time. Britain and Singapore and United States left UNESCO because they felt that UNESCO, rather than promoting freedom of expression, was promoting government control of expression, right? So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, there is a genuine desire to repatriate information and to have information and supporting your own culture and society, right? But at the same time, there's a genuine concern that too much government control of that process can lead to government control and very much stifle the very freedom that you want. So that debate took a long time to happen before CARNA came into being, and then CARMAC, the Caribbean Institute of Media and Communication, to which Professor Padovani mentioned that I'm associated, came in for the training of journalists, so that we were concerned both with the development of media institutions and development of media professionals. The two things were seen as going hand in hand. And forming the Caribbean Broadcasting Union as the other leg of the institutional arrangement to give expression to the ideas of regional integration, because we were the feeling in the region that although we were 12, 14 separate islands and territories, that there was a commonality of history and culture that brought us together, and therefore communication and media, because we are separated by sea. But if you look at it, look at the map of the world one way, it looks as if we are separated by sea. If you look at it the way I look at it, we are joined by the sea. So rather than seeing the sea as a point of separation, you can see the sea as a point of contact. The sea is what connects us. And the history, and the culture, and the language, and all of those things. So we have flirted with the idea of regional integration at the political level from time to time, but we have not quite made it. But throughout the period, from the period of the 1960s to the present time, there have been continuing efforts to get regional integration supported by a communication and media infrastructure. The arguments between the private and the public eventually died, and now within the Caribbean Broadcasting Union are both public and private owners. I digress to say that one of the problems that they encounter all along is managing the commercial aspect of an organization that's both governmental and private. I'll give you a concrete example. Cricket, anybody here knows cricket besides John? Okay, a couple of you have an idea of what cricket is. Well, my friends from Pakistan and Bangladesh understand the passion of cricket, and I can only tell you that baseball is without passion by comparison. If you understand that, you have an idea what we're talking about. But when we're playing cricket at the test cricket level, West Indies playing against England or Bangladesh or Pakistan or India or Australia, just about everything stops. On a really important test match, government and the economy and politics, all of those things take second place while you listen to the radio. Now, the broadcasting of these games is very important and is commercially very important. But the rights for major sporting events particularly in the last couple of years when salaries for athletes of any kind have become astronomical, maybe not like LeBron James, but still in our part of the world, still huge salaries nevertheless. I think Sachin Tendulkar in cricket perhaps earns as much as any American athlete of a similar nature because he is a superstar. So I'm sitting at a meeting of the Caribbean Broadcasting Union, and we're buying the rights for sports, for cricket. And because we are not for profit, the rights cost is shared by the member stations, plus a 10% for administrative arrangements. But everybody has to pay for it to work. And it was worked out in a fair equity, you know. A Jamaican station would pay 24% of the cost, Trinidad 20%, and down to smaller stations pay 1%, etc. Okay. So there's a station in Grenada that has not paid their dues. They don't have the cash. And the Prime Minister calls on the phone to say, I want the cricket on the station. You know? I would say, but Prime Minister, your station is in arrears. Now, it's not easy to be a board member of the CBU telling not the Prime Minister's secretary, the Prime Minister on the phone in a board meeting saying, I want the cricket. Now, the Prime Minister gets the cricket. And we go into the red. Because the others, and then other people say, oh, in that case, I'm not paying my share either. Because all I need to do is delay, and the day of the game, Prime Minister picks up the phone and calls, and we get it. So that has dogged the ability of the regional arrangement to develop a mechanism to aggregate and distribute content, whether it's of sport, culture, entertainment, news, whatever, because unless everybody pays, it doesn't work. And everybody doesn't pay. Right? The alternative is to make it into a completely commercial operation. Right? And this is what has been done to some extent. But that did not work either because the government-owned stations did not want a commercial operation because every prime minister wants the ability at the end of the day to call on the phone and say, I like the cricket. Right? And no private investor is going to put money into a Caribbean Media Corporation where that can happen. Right? So that's why the project remains in limbo, how to get that happening. All right. And in between all of that now, as I said, we are now in the current period in which we have the period of market liberalization, consequent on the things that you all are aware of, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Washington Consensus, the magic of the marketplace, and all the things that you are all familiar with. I don't need to bore you with those details. The market won, you know, and the market rules. The market won, the market rules. So that from 1989 onwards, all our governments have been adopting more market policies in their domestic economic arrangements, and the state media was also a part of that. Somebody asked me today, and I need to make the point again as well, that there's a mixed view about the state ownership because people in the region don't have an intrinsic opposition to governments owning the media, but they have a fundamental opposition to the governments using that ownership to promote themselves at the expense of the opposition or civil society groups, right? And because, I mean, we are a region of open democratic societies where governments are regularly changed in open and free elections. And so people don't take kindly to government control of sorts of media for its own ends. And where that has not happened, the stations can continue. So what we end up with is a regime in which the market there's been a proliferation of radio license and television license, and competition in television as well. The exceptions being, notable exceptions being Barbados and the Bahamas, where the governments continue to invest a lot in the public television services and also to keep out private ownership. In most of the region, the pattern is competition between the state sector and the new licensees being private, okay? And then, of course, we have an international environment in which, through satellite and cable, we have a lot of international channels. Jamaica is located, like the rest of the Caribbean, in the footprints of the US domestic satellites, so that programs on satellite that are intended for the southern part of the United States can be accessed quite easily in Jamaica. And that has fueled the development of the cable sector, which began initially as small operators staying in their neighborhoods, getting one dish on their roof, pulling down some programs, sharing it with the neighbors on either side, then getting more wires, adding more neighbors, the next street, and until you have a whole district. So in 1996, what the government of Jamaica did was to rationalize all of that and put the international cable channels under license, but in relatively small units, so that for purposes of licensing, the units are 2,500 households, right? Which means that you have scores of licensees. Although some have multiple zones, but you can have an operator with a license in as few as a zone of 2,500 households, or add-ons as you so wish. And the idea was to allow the operators who started off informally, illegally, to be able to operate. Because if you had opened up to larger geographic entities requiring more capital investment, then it's likely that many of them would have gone under. So it was to protect the incumbents that you had this system. All right, so those are some of the examples of the consequence of privatization. As you were told before, in Jamaica, the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation was privatized to Radio Jamaica, which, as I told you, was the output of one of the British rediffusion 4 stations. And they acquired both the television and some of the radio assets of the Jamaica Broadcasting Corporation. In Belize, the Belize Broadcasting Corporation was privatized. In Grenada, the government station was sold to one of the Trinidad operators, and in Trinidad, the government did not privatize the state-owned station, but they commercialized it. So it is no longer in any way, shape, or form a public broadcaster in that sense of the word, but an entirely commercial operator owned by the government. And all of this has seen, so as a consequence of all these developments, that the media in the Caribbean is largely advertising driven. Right? Now, at the international level, the growth of the multiple channels have created new competition zones for the private broadcasters. And in the old days, when you could guarantee an advertiser large audience because you're the only game in town or one of two, that's no longer the case. So the number one radio station has moved from a 60% market share to a 30% market share. Right? 27% market share over a matter of just 5 years. Right? And so market share ranges from 1% for some of the smaller stations to as much as 25 or 30% for the larger ones. So that becomes an issue. How do you manage in a commercial environment when your audiences are shrinking and therefore you can no longer guarantee an advertiser the large audiences that they need? Another issue from this is the issue of violations of copyright and intellectual property rights, because the cable operators, they offer a lot of these US premium channels which are not available for sale in our part of the world. So what happens is that a cable licensee in Jamaica, for instance, would apply for a license on the basis that he's offering these 15 or 20 channels for which he has a licensing arrangement. And he does have a licensing arrangement. Home and Garden, the cooking channel, hairdressing, I don't know. So he comes to the commission and he gets his license on that basis. But he goes to you to sell you his channels, and it shows HBO and Cinemax and all the premium channels in the United States. And he doesn't pay for them because he says, when I offer to pay for them, HBO says they're not for sale because they're only for sale in the domestic United States. And so that's not, so the operator says, well, I have tried to buy it, but so I have done my duty by trying to buy it. The seller won't sell me, therefore I've done my duty. The regulator takes the view that they are regulating the licenses which they have, and they would respond to complaints. The regulator is not going to go out to look to see if John has HBO illegally. That's for HBO to complain. So if HBO doesn't complain, the regulator doesn't go out to find it. But there's a huge issue because what the United States has done is to tie the copyright to trade issues, right? And so a lot of even American aid under the Caribbean Basin Initiative is tied to compliance with copyright arrangements. And so each year the State Department publishes a list of countries who are or are not in compliance of their copyright arrangements. And they have Jamaica as one of the countries that is trying. So, because at least there's a license. But it remains a large problem for the region because, and it goes throughout the entire Caribbean region. People are accustomed to these high-value content which are not available. So it is politically unfeasible to take them off. And so unless the United States and the owners here make a complete pressure for that, then it's not likely to happen in the near future. But it does have a continuing problem. I mentioned earlier on the high cost of broadcast for international sports and so on, and the unauthorized access to product, which creates some market distortion because the broadcast stations are buying the content at the copyright marketed level because they are visible and easy to find, whereas the cable operators under the radar are not. So they can offer product at prices which are outside of market. In Jamaica, for instance, for 120 channels of cable, including a dozen or more premium channels, you probably pay the equivalent of about 15 or 16 US dollars per month. No, for that kind of lineup here, you probably pay what, $100 or thereabouts, I don't know. So you see the level of market distortion that we're talking about there. So that's the new landscape, very difficult, an advertising-driven media in which the competition for advertising dollar is getting stronger and stronger. Now, the media, the mature media, radio, television, newspapers, are trying to respond, but they have to face the number of issues. One of them is this legal and regulatory framework that I just mentioned. Another one which I want to spend a little bit of time on is what I call the awards in libel and defamation cases. Because in recent years, there have been several large libel awards that have been granted by the courts in Jamaica. One of the most egregious was one with a minister of government who sued a newspaper for a story which said that he had accepted bribes under the table when he was minister from an advertising agency that worked for the government. The story originated with the Associated Press out of New York and was carried by the Gleaner. And Associated Press retracted the story, saying they had rechecked and they don't think they have a basis for the story. The Gleaner nevertheless carried the story and continued to carry the story. To cut to the chase very quickly, after 16 years of going back and forth through the courts, the ex-minister won a large award. Initially, he won an award of $2.3 million, US dollars, which is huge damages in a company that doesn't make that in profit in a year. After appeals, it was reduced to a little over $1 million, but still, where I come from, $1 million is still a fair amount of money. What that has done is to create a kind of chilling effect on journalism, because that, in conjunction with other awards, because it's not the only one, that has been quite substantive. And so the reporting has been less aggressive, and there's a lot of demand for reform of the libel laws to bring them more in line with the United States, where public officials have difficulty suing after the Sullivan versus New York Times famous case of the 1960s. There is a process now to review that, and I'm not sure where the process will end, because the new Prime Minister, who was elected in the elections on September 3rd, Bruce Golden, has promised to reform the laws, because he believes that the libel laws should not be, in his words, a shield behind which corrupt public officials can hide. Now that he's Prime Minister, I don't know if he will say the same thing, but certainly he said it very loud and clear when he was in opposition seeking the support of the media for his election. He got the support, he got elected, so we see what will happen. We also have, under the commercial pressures, declining standards in journalism. People are not staying long enough in the profession. People graduating out of our university and other universities in Jamaica enter the media, stay for a couple of years, leave, they get more money in either new media environments or more fun, and certainly more money in public relations, advertising, and social marketing. Right? So keeping good people in journalism is one of the challenges facing us. As well as what we now have is obviously a brand new workplace in the internet environment, and a new workforce of young people with different kind of attitudes and expectations. So that has been also one of the challenges to which they are beginning to respond with a number of strategies, and I'm going to try and finish it up quickly, such as trying to manage cost, diversifying revenue sources by things like less dependence on advertising, the older media reselling archival material. We've also seen a fair number of mergers and acquisitions as small media companies are taken up by new ones, leading to the Pan-Caribbean media environments. The number of stations, adding platforms so that, for instance, if you get a license, you will then create, instead of having just one music channel, you would have 3 music channels, one adult contemporary, one hip hop, one reggae, perhaps one soca, so that you can appeal to different niche markets with different products, and also trying to market some of these products to Jamaicans in the diaspora, particularly in North America and the United Kingdom, where most of them are located. So, 2 major approaches. One is the Caribbean Media Corporation, which I mentioned before, has formed a Caribbean Vision channel, which is distributed on satellite in North America and on cable in the Caribbean region. It is the fledgling aspect of what is expected to be a Caribbean station. We don't know if that's going to happen. For the problem that I mentioned, because of this odd kind of ownership where it's not commercially driven and it's not funded by the state. So its future for me is uncertain, particularly in the light of these other developments where the private media are forming their own groups by merging and consolidating across the region. The biggest one is One Caribbean Media. Now, One Caribbean Media is a merger of the CCN group in Trinidad, which owns the major newspaper in Trinidad, the major television station, and in Barbados they own a major newspaper, a satellite distribution company, 3 radio stations, and a radio station in Grenada. So that makes them a fairly large media group. And as they call themselves One Caribbean Media, their intention is clear: to continue the growth and expansion in the region that could not happen under that private mixed state ownership that we mentioned before. Their main competitor is the Columbia's Communication Group, which is headed by one of the wealthiest individuals in Jamaica and in the region, Michael Lee Chin, who is listed among Forbes 500 richest men in the world. And the Lee Chin Group owns television and cable in Jamaica, cable in Bahamas, cable in Trinidad, and also an undersea submarine fiber optic network. So their potential for growth is the largest because they're now looking towards the Hispanic part of the Caribbean as well. And they will be joined soon by the Carlos Slim from Mexico, whose media operation is buying out one of the smaller telephone cable services in the region. So what we're going to be seeing more is a lot more competition and players in that area. So that's the big old groups. Then you have new groups that are forming. I mentioned 2 here, Hype and Sportsmax. Because Hype is a reggae music station out of Jamaica. Started out operating only in Jamaica, but now having outlets in North America. And their intention is to do the reverse of what BET or VH1 has done by forming Tempo to come to the Caribbean. So they're going from the Caribbean this way with music programs, mainly reggae and dancehall. But they're not the only one, but I mentioned them as one example of that genre. Then Sportsmax, another Jamaican company, which their strategy is to acquire very attractive sports products. The main ones being cricket and football, soccer, for those who don't know better. And they use that to, and they have a very interesting thing because they have a mixture of subscription and advertising as their revenue base. Right? They charge about $5 a month for a box for their channel in your home. Now, $5 should be seen in the context of $15 for 120 channels. So 5 for 1, is a lot of money. But that's their model. It's driven by, and they're doing quite well. So they pull the programming from, and they also have, and they bought out Fox, the Caribbean rights for Fox Sports Network, all right? So, and they have the rights for Italian soccer, the Italian Serie A. They have the English Premier League, and they also have the Bundesliga, and they also have the South American soccer. So they have soccer from all over the world. So if you want to watch football, and we're football mad and passionate, as long with cricket, you have to find $5 a month to do it. So it makes it possible for them. And they bring it into Jamaica and then uplink it back to the rest of the Caribbean, and they repeat the pattern there. And they also get advertising, so they get 2 bites of the cherry. So those are 2 kinds of responses which are quite creative and which I believe are going to develop. Where they are short at the present time is in developing Jamaican sports content. They're now just beginning to do that with some of these Jamaican sports. Okay. So in summary then, what we're seeing is that the old media business that depending on advertising is dead, and the new media business is still not yet taking shape, but it is taking shape. It is, we're seeing new models between media and advertising, as we see, for instance, in a brand that we call Rising Star, which is a Jamaican equivalent of the American Idol, and people pay for this. I mean, the phone-in to support the stars it's like a license to steal, really, because entire communities will support the people. If you get on Rising Stars, people are going to get on the phone, text messages in Jamaican dollars, right? A normal text message in Jamaican dollars is $3. To text for Rising Star is $25. Right? If you want to vote for a favorite star on Rising Star, is $25. So it's a huge, huge thing, and it is popular. But that's just one example of a switch away from advertising to getting the consumer to pay for the product indirectly. And we're seeing subscription of the kind that we talked about, like with the Sportsmax model. The multiple ownership is going to continue. We're going to see a lot more mergers and consolidation, and the decline in the state sector is going to continue. The strength of the old media, of course, is that they have a history of creating content. They have a history of credibility in many cases, and they also have a history of gatekeeping, so that things simply don't happen as it would happen in any of the social marketing networks, MySpace or whatever is your particular space. Public broadcasting, a very uncertain future. I believe that the old model of public broadcasting is just as dead as the old model of commercial broadcasting, but I also believe that it can be refined, and because I think there's some things which publics want which are not responsive to commercial entities. I believe the richness and experience of the social networks is an indication that that is desirable. What we are not quite sure is how all of that is going to happen as the broadband becomes more pervasive. I believe also that in terms of public policy, that one of the things is to have more public access to private media through the regulatory framework. And it is not difficult to design if you really set your mind to it. the regulations that we have cannot regulate media in the internet age. But at the end of the day, we're talking about content. We're talking about trying to create a Caribbean presence using media in the Caribbean to bring the people of the Caribbean together. I believe that that really means cultural relevance. And so the search really is to find financing models that can make culturally relevant programming that can be of value to people in the Caribbean and people in a Caribbean state of mind in whatever part of the world they find themselves. I thank you for your attention.